Hey everybody, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is Dorie Clark. So Dorie is the author of Reinventing You, of Stand Out, and the ebook Stand Out Networking. She's a former presidential campaign spokeswoman. She teaches at the Duke University's Fuqua School of Business that's right down the road from where I grew up. And she's also a consultant and a speaker for clients like Google, Morgan Stanley, and the World Bank. I'm excited to have Dorie here. Really excited, especially, forget the North Carolina, South Carolina connection. That's always cool. But I'm excited to talk about books and talk about also writing for high profile sites, which Dorie has done a lot of. So Dorie, thanks. Welcome. Great to have you here.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chandler.
Awesome. Well, I want to start by taking it back, take us back to the beginning of this whole writing journey. Like, when did you when did you start writing? And then how did that whole process start and move into writing your first book?
Well, I had wanted to write a book for a really long time. It was kind of a childhood goal even. And so in 2009, I decided, this is going to be it. This is going to be the year. And I figured I would just pound something out and something would work by sheer brute force. And so that year, in the first 6 months of that year, I wrote 3 different book proposals, and I figured that one of them would take. Someone would be interested in at least one of them, because I thought, well, these are good topics. But the truth was, I really didn't understand the publishing process, and what I discovered was that no one was interested in anything because I didn't have a strong enough platform, as they say. I was basically not famous enough, and so everything got turned down, and I was really frustrated. But what I discovered was that if I wanted to publish a book, at least commercially, I would need to start from square one. And so for me, that meant putting the book idea on the back burner and digging into blogging. And so that was something that for the next couple of years I pursued really aggressively to try to make that possible. And I ultimately started first blogging for the Huffington Post, then for the Harvard Business Review, and then for a number of other publications. And it was that blogging that enabled me to build up my platform to the place where publishers were interested, and I was able to write my first book and publish it with a mainstream publisher.
That's awesome. So how did you get started? You said Huffington Post was the first blog that you were writing for?
Yeah, so one of the best ways, of course, to get started blogging is to follow warm leads that you might have. Of course, you can always cold call or just send an email pitch to people, and I have done that with a number of publications and can talk about it. But I figured, for my first one, I wanted to try to see if I could get people that I knew to introduce me. And that's, if you have that resource, that's the very best way to do it, especially for publications like Forbes or the Huffington Post. At this point, they have thousands of contributors. So a lot of people actually might know folks that they don't even know, right, for the Huffington Post or some other publication like it. So what I did was I began doing some research and trying to figure out who I knew that wrote for them. I found actually about half a dozen friends that were Huffington Post contributors. And interestingly enough, because they have a little bit of a weird system there, I would ask these friends, hey, can you introduce me to your editor? Most of the people actually didn't really have a proper editor per se, and I thought it was a little weird, but it was in fact true that they didn't have a good inside contact, even though they were a contributor. But one friend did, finally, after I just kept asking. You had to be really persistent. And so there was a guy named Michael Silberman who I knew, who was a contributor. He was willing to introduce me to his editor, and as soon as he did that, basically, just getting the say-so from Michael was pretty much enough. And so the guy reached out to me, said, here's your login, now you're a contributor. And it was like, whoa, okay. And at that point onward, I could upload pretty much whatever I wanted. So it was great, but it came through warm leads, asking people I know to make introductions. And for that, for your listeners, I'd say the things that you want to have ready are a short bio, like a paragraph bio. You want to have links to about 3 or 4 clips that you've done, so blog posts that you've published on your blog or elsewhere, so that people can see how you are as a writer. And then prepare maybe a few sentences or a paragraph about the type of thing that you'd like to write for that outlet and how frequently you'd like to write. If you can assemble those things and send it on to your friend as kind of a packet so that they can just forward it, that'll make their lives a lot easier.
So you're taking out some of the work for them to introduce you to the editor by answering a lot of the questions that the editor is going to ask anyway.
Exactly, yes.
Cool. So what made you decide to focus on the Huffington Post first instead of a different site? Was it because you had the most connections, or what was you thinking there?
So I was simultaneously pursuing a lot of different things. It was very much a like throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks sort of thing. So the Huffington Post actually was not my top choice necessarily because I was wanting to publish a business book, and the Huffington Post is not really known for business coverage. I mean, they have it, but it's not their raison d'etre the way that the politics is. I was simultaneously trying to break in at a number of other places, Inc., Fast Company. Both of those have published things that I've done subsequently, but at the time I was having a really hard time breaking in there. In both cases, I think I was able to, I did have contacts who were willing to introduce me and did, but the editors at the time, this is a few years back, basically just dropped the ball. They were, not that interested, or they got busy or whatever. And so, I would be really polite and I'd, send these follow-up messages, but they were basically blowing me off. So the Huffington Post was the first one that actually just stuck. So that was why that came to fruition. I was simultaneously looking at other places; they just weren't working.
Got it. So then you got the end with the Huffington Post, and they said, here's your login, your contributor. It's like, whoa, all this power. What happened next? Was it going through? Were you blogging for a while? Then did you circle back and come to the books? Did you go on to guest posting for some other sites? Like, what was that kind of chain of events after that?
So I began doing some stuff for the Huffington Post. Now that I had this power, now that I had the keys to the kingdom. But the other thing that I did, I knew that would not necessarily be sufficient. I thought it was good. I thought it was a good start. But because I wanted to write a business book, I wanted to have at least one business publication that I was writing for as well on a regular basis. So I just kept going. I kept pursuing different leads. And one of the ones that actually just came to me in kind of a lucky break was that summer I sold my bicycle on Craigslist. And it turned out, I was living in Boston at the time, the woman who bought it was a copy editor at the Harvard Business Review. And I didn't know this about her. I mean, we were just she was emailing me, from her Gmail account or something. But smart woman that she is, she decided to vet me a little bit before buying my bicycle to make sure I wasn't going to scam her. And so she looked me up online and saw that I was, a business consultant and writer. And so she mentioned to me when I was selling her the bike, she said, "Oh, I work for the Harvard Business Review." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And, I'm always on the lookout for opportunities. And so I said, "Well, you guys have a blog, right? What does it take to start blogging for you?" And so I had to follow up and pursue the lead a few times, but eventually she introduced me to an editor there. And because I had these pitches and these draft posts all ready to go, because I had been trying fruitlessly to break in with these other publications, the minute I got the introduction to him, I was able to send him, this really detailed set of stuff, which he looked over and he said, "Oh, this is actually pretty good." And so he started printing my stuff. And so that got me in the queue for the Harvard Business Review, and I began writing for them regularly. And it was actually the second post that I ever wrote. It was called "How to Reinvent Your Personal Brand," and that became popular. And as a result of that, they asked me if I would take that blog post and turn it into a magazine piece for the Harvard Business Review magazine, which I did. And when the magazine piece came out, got approached by 3 different literary agents asking if I would be interested in turning it into a book. And I was like, well, yes, I would. And so I really quickly wrote a proposal, and we were able to sell it. And it got published 2 years later by the Harvard Business Review Press.
Wow, that's awesome. I want to dive more on that in just a second. I want to take a couple steps back and then hone in on one thing, which was that process. You said it took a few follow-ups, and you just kind of skipped over that. And I feel like a lot of people, they might look from the outside and say, "Dorie, that's awesome. You got to write for the Harvard Business Review," but I couldn't do that. I don't have any contacts or anything, but I love how it's something as simple as selling your bike. And I can just picture the intro to the editor, like, hey, here's Dorie. I bought a bike from her. She wants to write for she wants to write for us. Like that must have been a hilarious intro in itself. But talk about that follow-up, because that's something that anyone can do. Anyone can be persistent, but a lot of people don't. So what did that follow-up look like, and how did you eventually, through persistence, and you said a few times, how did you eventually get them to say yes?
Yeah, so this woman, the cop getter, her name was Josette, and so when I met her in person and was asking about how do you become a contributor, she what she said to me at the time was, well, gosh, that isn't really my area of specialty, but I could introduce you to this editor, and so she had already basically promised that she would do it, and so my assumption going in was that she would. She had said she would, so she will. But I also know that people get busy. So if I'm remembering correctly, this is about 5 years ago now. I emailed her the first time, and I didn't hear anything back, because the first message was basically, hey, Josette, great to meet you. Thanks so much for your kind offer to introduce me to the editor. Please, let me know if I can, send you anything, and what would make this easier for you, or how we can arrange this. So I didn't hear anything. And so then, you don't want to badger somebody, but you want to wait respectful periods of time. So I waited about a week, and then I sent her another follow-up. And I think that for that one, she wrote back, and she was something like, oh, okay, I'll talk to him, and I'll get back to you, something like that. So I was like, all right, well, the ball is in her court, but I need to wait. And then, it was a while, and I wasn't hearing anything. And I'm like, well, so was that a yes? Was that a no? Like, where are we? So I waited somewhere between another week and maybe 2 weeks, and then I looped back again, and I said, well, hey, thank you so much for talking to the editor, just wondering how it went. If he's not interested, that's totally fine, because you want to take the pressure off. But, if he would be open to an introduction, I would love to meet him. Please let me know. So basically I'm trying to be chill, but just letting her know that I would like a response one way or another. And so I think it was maybe with the third one that she wrote back, and she's like, oh yeah, he'd be glad to talk to you and look at your stuff. Here's his email address. But if I had gotten discouraged along the way and not followed up, it's likely that connection would not have taken place, because it did require a little bit of extra effort.
That's great. And thanks for walking us through that. That's cool to hear. And especially how you turned that, what felt like at multiple points, kind of what people do in this situation, right? Like a or a sure yes, and then they don't follow through. And it's, you have to craftfully, I loved hearing your responses on that. So now let's fast forward, jump back into the story here, where you were talking about, so wrote this piece, it got in the magazine, you got approached by 3 different agents, and then okay, now you've got the book deal. Was the book deal easy to get from that point once they reached out to you and once you got the book proposals done, or what was that process like?
It actually kind of was, which, if it always, I think for any author, right, it depends where you start the story, because if I started the story with, I wrote this blog post for the Harvard Business Review, then they asked me to make it into an article, and then all these agents approached me, and then I was able to sell it to Harvard Business Review right away. I mean, that sounds like a really easy story, but the backstory here is that the process had started 2 years earlier, writing these 3 manuscripts that are not manuscripts, but these 3 proposals that got all rejected, and I had to just go from there and really be persistent and continue doing it. That part was absolutely not easy. But the selling of it, once I had written the piece for HBR, that actually was. So I mean, to a certain extent, once the wind is at your back, sometimes you do get some breaks.
Got it. And what made you want to write this book, or write a book so bad in the first place?
It's probably hard to describe. I mean, I think it was mostly a question of just, since I was a kid, thinking it was a really cool thing. Sometimes we just have these bucket list activities, and so for me, it was something along those lines that I thought it would be something really neat and impressive and meaningful to have done. So I felt a real sense of desire that this was something that was important for me to do.
And so did you shape, because you talked about how you had the 3 manuscripts. Did you shape your life kind of around this? It sounds like, it was like blogging with the intent to eventually get a book deal. Like, was that pretty intentional with the end goal of eventually getting that book published, or not?
It was, yeah. I probably would not have chosen to blog otherwise. I mean, I like blogging now, but it wasn't like, oh, I have this burning desire, I must blog. It started out as a very instrumental goal for me in terms of doing the thing that I really wanted to do, which was getting a book published.
And so what did it feel like when you finally got that publishing deal?
It was it was stressful at first, actually, because Harvard Business Review Press, which ended up publishing it, they made an offer, and I mean, I didn't have any idea what was a good offer, what was not a good offer, but I had an agent that was representing me, and she said, you know what, I think we can do better. I think we should turn this down. And it's like this moment of trust where it's like, oh my God, I have a book offer from Harvard Business Review Press, and you're saying like, no, tell them no. And it was like, oh my God, that's a little bit brazen to do that. It was a very nerve-wracking moment to have the leap of faith, to just trust her judgment to do that. But I did, and they came back and they had a better offer. So that was great. So I think that moment where we had to make the decision about what we actually should be asking for, that was stressful, but it was really a fantastic feeling. I was actually in Europe. I had just flown out on a 2-week trip to Europe. And so when I got the news about the book deal coming through, I was in Munich, and to be on this European vacation and to have a book deal, that was a really nice feeling.
That's hilarious. It's funny how similar our stories are. Because I was actually studying abroad in Austria, in Innsbruck, which is, a 2-hour train ride from Munich. When my first book started taking off and it was making money, and I was snowboarding, and it was like you're probably with you, it was this surreal experience and this light bulb moment of like, wow, this is what's happening in my life right now, and I didn't believe this would ever happen, but also this is a glimpse into the future of what can happen, and it just totally opened up my eyes to things to come.
Yeah, that's great.
So that had to be an amazing feeling.
It was pretty cool. I mean, I guess, this, maybe everyone's like this, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it was an amazing feeling, but it was also tempered with this feeling of like, okay, I'm not really going to trust this until everything is signed. So I was happy on the trip, but I kept thinking like, all right, there could be some way that this gets screwed up, or what if when we're negotiating the final whatever something falls through. So it wasn't really, even though I had the verbal agreement, and I mean, the verbal agreement is pretty good because they don't want to burn some agent that they work with all the time. I kept being paranoid all up until the minute when I had the signed contract in my hand.
And then at that moment, what was it like?
In that moment, it was pretty cool, and I felt like I had achieved something that I had been aiming at for a really long time. I mean, the truth is, there's a phenomenon in sociology known as shifting baseline syndrome, and it applies to a lot of different things. But I mean, we always are wanting more, and it was great to get the book deal, but then the thing began of like, well, how do I make it a bestseller? And you sort of start the next quest. So I think that's something that we have to guard against. That we have to know ourselves enough to be satisfied and to really relish these moments before jumping on to the next thing, because it's a very human thing to do that, but we need to know how to savor what we're experiencing.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the writing for a little bit, and then I want to really hone in on some of the marketing pieces. So the writing process, you'd already written some manuscripts. You wrote the piece that kind of became the focal point for the book. What did the writing process look like once you got the deal from start to finish?
So I write pretty quickly. I used to be a journalist, and so the writing part was not that necessarily that onerous for me. The way that I like to do it is I like to do all the interviews up front, and so I have all of the source material in front of me, and then I can shape it and move it around and figure out what's going to be in what chapter. Just play with it, and then once I have the quotes as the backbone, or the sort of general stories as the backbone, then I can go through and weave them together. So I would say that the process of doing interviewing and writing the first draft, I did it over a summer. So probably it took me about 3 months to write my first draft of the book, and then of course there's tons of back and forth, and that took a long time. For Harvard Business Review Press, they actually have this sort of lingering conceit of an academic publisher where they do a peer review. So actually, I went through 3 rounds of edits of my manuscript with my editor, and then they do they do this peer review where they send it out to 3 or 4, I think it's 4 different people in the industry to be like, is this worthy of publication? And by that time, usually, almost always it is, because you've had HBR editors combing over it, but occasionally they get people saying, no, this is total crap, you can't publish it. And so, even up to that point, it was like, oh my God, I hope that they like it. I hope that they're, that they're not going to like torpedo it at the end. But fortunately they didn't. But the editing took a long time because there were many back and forths between it.
Got it. So it's about 3 months or a summer to write it. And then how long did that editing process take?
So I started writing the book basically as soon as the contract was signed. So that was like May, June of 2011. Mm-hmm. And the final draft, the final version of it was submitted and into the publisher by Labor Day of 2012. And then it came out about, what would that be, 7 months later.
Got it.
So it was released in April of 2013. So it's a 2-year process, basically, from start to finish.
Okay. Now, when it came out, let's dive into some of the marketing stuff you did there. So obviously, you're working with a publisher, and this will be a little bit different than some people who are self-publishing. But I'd like to talk about some of the things you did on the publishing side, and then we can draw back some things as well to some lessons learned that people can apply in self-publishing. So when we're talking about things on your side with the publisher and with marketing, like what were a few of the things you did up front as part of your marketing plan to really move books and to make the book do well?
Yeah, so I'll put a little asterisk on this, in that for my first book, despite my attempting to prepare myself and talk to people and sort of know what I should be doing, I was just, kind of clueless. I mean, I did okay. I probably did better than some people, but I really didn't know. It felt like a freight train hitting me. So it was actually for my second book, which just came out about 2 months ago, Stand Out, which I was really able to market it in a far more effective way. Mm-hmm. So I mean, a few things that I learned in between book number 1 and book number 2. One is the really paramount importance of early purchases, bulk purchases, and pre-orders. And so a couple of things that I did that I would certainly recommend for people. One is, with bulk purchases, particularly if you're writing in the nonfiction genre, there are probably going to be people who are interested in your book, having you speak about it. And so you can offer them deals where if you normally charge for your speeches, you can say, look, I'll waive my fees if you buy X number of copies, and promise that you will order them by such and such date, so that they can all get counted for that first week's sales, which is really critical. You want to have a lot of momentum out of the gate. So that's a really important thing to do, which I was not thinking about enough for Reinventing You, but by the time Stand Out came out, I had gotten very disciplined about that. Another thing that's really important is literally, I mean, the people who are going to form the core of your buying audience are the people who know you now. I mean, eventually, sure, your book is going to get momentum and strangers are going to buy it. But in the early days, it's the people who know you that are going to support it. And so reaching out in advance, I actually started this for the new book, Stand Out. It was released in late April. And starting in January, I started emailing about 100 people a day. And I would ask them personally to purchase the book, and I included a pre-order link in it. And by doing that, I was able to generate, pretty large numbers of individual pre-orders. And that's important because, if you want to hit the bestseller list or make an effort or an attempt to hit the bestseller list, it can't just be all bulk purchases. It needs to be a mix of bulk and individual purchases as well. So doing that is a great way to do it. And it means that you have people early on who are getting your book, they're presumably going to read it, and then they can become viral ambassadors for you so that the word can spread faster and more efficiently.
Got it. That's awesome. So you said 100 a day?
Yeah. So the way that I did it specifically, here's my killer secret. I have everybody I know in a database, and so I created this spreadsheet. And so what I would do is I had a standard message that would go out to everybody just saying like, hey, here's my book, here's what it's about, here's the link to pre-order it, it would really make a difference, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would do is additionally, I would create a special column where it would be like a notes column, and I would do a personal message to each of the people. And it didn't have to be long, but it could just be like, hey, hope your trip to Aspen this Christmas was wonderful, or oh, make sure you say hi to Bob and the kids, or whatever it is, and you'd plug that in there so that it was, you'd have the core message, but you'd also have the personalized touch, so that the people would be like, oh, this isn't just a blast email that's going out to everybody, because people ignore those. Only really highly motivated people are going to buy a book off of a blast email, but a personalized email is something different. And so I would use a mail merge function. It was called Yet Another Mail Merge on with merging with Google Sheets, and it allows you up to 100 a day to send that out through Gmail, and that was a pretty fast and effective way of doing it.
So that process you would go through, and you would go through names and then type out next to them, like in a little Excel sheet or something, like one little sentence or two, and then you just went down the list, and then
Precisely.
It would automatically mail merge that and send that out, and then you just queued them up at 100 a day?
That's correct, yes.
Got it. And so I love that tactic, first off. But how did you have so many people? I mean, 100 a day, how many days could you keep that up?
I kept it up for a lot of days. I have about 7,000 people that are in like my personal database. Just like people that I know. The way that I have that is that I have been pretty assiduous for the past decade about whenever I meet people and get their card or whatever. I'll plug them into my database. I mean, I'm for my email list, I'm of course only adding people who are opting into the email list, but this is like my personal database of just people I know, people I've met, people at conferences or whatever, and so some of them are very good friends and some of them are more casual acquaintances, but they're all people that I have some kind of a personal connection to. And so going through and sending them a one-time email saying, like, hey, I got this thing going on. That was my way of reaching out in a personalized way to the people that I know as an individual.
How did you keep up with like things to say for 7,000 people? That seems like just so many people.
Yeah, it was a lot. So for some, I could be a lot more specific than others. In my database, I will often, almost always, I'll write down how and where I met the person, so I have something to go on, and usually I remember them. But if I met them at a conference, I could say something like, "So, are you going to go to the such and such conference again this year?" So that's like a shared commonality that we have, or if I didn't remember that much about them, you could say, but oh, I know they live in Florida. I could say, well, how's life in Orlando treating you, or something like that. Whereas if I knew a lot about them, I could be really specific and say, oh, how's Jeremy doing with basketball this season, and what's the latest with your grandmother's new whatever, and go into those different levels of depth. But for almost everybody, if you have sufficient notes, there's at least something personal that you can say that shows that you're talking to them and not just being a robot.
Got it. That's awesome. So you take those notes down whenever you meet someone, and that's just in the database.
Yeah, exactly.
So how many books would you say this moved?
It moved, if we're talking about the individual personal emails, probably between 700 and 800. So I would say it was about a 10% uptake, which may not sound that great, but I mean, if you're comparing it to almost any other form of outreach for something where you're asking people to buy a $30 book, that's actually kind of huge. So once I invested the time to put in the special comments and things like that, I mean, it did take a lot of time, but once it's done, you can pretty much put it on autopilot. Every day you just click it and it would do the mail merge. But it's powerful because I was able to pre-sell many more bulk copies to places that I was speaking at, but it's the interest from individuals, in particular individuals around the country, that shows booksellers this is a book that has legs, this is a book that has traction, and that a diversity of people are interested in. This is not just somebody who's like getting their powerful corporate friends to write a few checks. This is something that that lots of people would like, and so therefore we should stock it. Therefore, we should order more of it. So I actually considered it a pretty important strategy.
So you're saying that there is a compound effect off the back end of much more than just those 700-800 copies, and much more than just those individual things. It was the sharing. It was the algorithms within book companies. It was all those things that led to a much bigger impact than just that.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that's useful is that if you have a lot of people who purchase your book as a pre-order, that means they're getting it, the day that it comes out. Those are people that a week later or 2 weeks later you can follow up with, and I kept records, so I knew exactly who they were. Anytime somebody told me they pre-ordered, I put them into a spreadsheet. You can follow up with them and say, hey, so glad, I'm so appreciative you pre-ordered the book. Will you write a review? And that online reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or Barnes & Noble, that makes a really big difference. And so whereas it took me a number of months with my first book to be able to get up over 100 reviews, I was able in a couple of weeks to get up over 100 reviews on Amazon for Standout. And as you know, that makes a huge difference in terms of social proof.
Absolutely. What were some other things that you did to market, especially the second book?
So a really big one was podcasts, and I think that particularly for business authors, there's a really great ecosystem that's in place with that, because there's so many interesting podcasts. So I made a point of reaching out to places that had me the first time when I had done Reinventing You, so I could follow up with them. B, reaching out to friends with podcasts, the sort of warm lead. C, figuring out whose podcasts I really wanted to be on, and then investigating which of my friends and contacts and colleagues had been on it, so I could see if I could get a warm introduction from them to that person. And then D, finally, just sometimes you can reach out cold and say, hey, I love your podcast. It looks interesting. I've been on X, Y, and Z podcasts, and so I thought that it might be a fit for your audience as well. What do you think? And you can actually get a pretty good stream that way. So I have actually, since I would say in about a 4-month period, starting before the launch of the book and going up, through a couple of months after the launch of the book, I have done, let's see, if we if we count it actually as of today, I tallied it as of last week. So as of today, I think it's probably about 124 podcast interviews slash webinars, which I'll kind of lump in with that. So it's been a lot of outreach. I've really been doubling down on that strategy.
Would you say that was the biggest mover of books for you, or was it bulk sales, or personal reach outs? Like, what was that?
Yeah, it's difficult, of course, to trace all of the sources, because unfortunately, if people are going and buying it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, there's no way to directly track who that person is unless they tell me that they've purchased it, or to figure out where exactly that traffic is coming from. However, the marker that I do control is my my email signups, and that has been really an interesting thing. That's something that I should mention too, is a really important marketing tool, because people, of course, right, intuitively, they're far more likely to buy your books if they become a fan of yours in general and stay in touch with you regularly and are kind of in your orbit. And so building your email list, of course, is really critical. What's the best way to build your email list? Well, it's certainly not saying, hey, join my email list, because that sounds really boring and you're not giving people a reason to do it. You need to have a really good, desirable opt-in. And so one of the things that I did that actually made a very big difference was I knew from the beginning I wanted to have a good giveaway. And so I created a 42-page workbook that is, it's really beautifully done, beautifully laid out. And it was an adaptation of Stand Out, just taking a lot of the questions, the self-assessment questions and the best material, and turning it into a free resource guide. And so anytime I would be on a podcast, I would mention it. I'd say, go to my website, DorieClark.com, and if you're interested in creating your own breakthrough idea and building a following around it, you can download it on my website for free. And so I would mention that on every website, on every podcast that I did, send them to my website. And for on the days when the podcast would hit, I would get 200, 300 sometimes email signups. You'd really see a big hit coming in from as a result of that. So that's been huge, and it consequently leads me to believe that many of those people may also simultaneously have gone to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and purchased a copy of the book as well. But the email list growth, which I've been able to chart, has been very much correlated to podcast appearances.
Got it. Now, what are some of the biggest lessons learned for you on the marketing side from book launch 1 to book launch 2?
Well, one of the things that I did differently with book launch 2, and I think in general this was a good idea. I knew I wanted to have a book tour, a physical book tour. This has kind of gone out of style in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly it's gone out of style with publishers who don't want to pay for it. But some people think, well, just do podcasts. Why do you need to travel? I actually think that if you have certain cities where you have large enough bases of an audience or people that it actually really is useful to have an appearance there as a driving factor. So you don't want to go to a tiny town where you don't know anybody. I mean, some people actually have. I'll put a little flag on it. Somebody like Chris Guillebeau certainly has extolled the virtues of going to random tiny little towns and meeting people, and says that's been good for business. And perhaps in his case it has. But for many people, it's not worth it to go to a place where you don't know a lot of folks and you're going to get a turnout of 3 people. But if you have a city where hundreds of people and you feel pretty confident that you can turn out 50 or 100 for an event, that's actually really good, because even the people that don't come to the event, you have an excuse to reach out to them. You have an excuse to say, hey, I'm going to be in your town. Come to this event. I'd love to see you. Oh, and if you can't come, here's the link to buy the book anyway. So, it's a good personalized opportunity to do that form of outreach. So for me, those cities would be New York, Washington, San Francisco, and Los Angeles in particular. And so I made a book tour around that. And that was useful. I did it in a very structured and systematic way, which I didn't do for Reinventing You. For that, I was just like flying all around the country in kind of a random way based on when invitations would come in. But for Standout, I planned it better. I planned the schedule better. So it was long book tour. I was on the road 3.5 weeks consecutively, and then I'd be home for a couple of days and then back out a little bit more. But so for about a 2-month period overall, I was traveling very, very heavily. But it was not as hard on me because I was doing things smarter. I'd fly from Seattle to San Francisco and from San Francisco to Los Angeles, so I wouldn't kill myself with it, and that worked pretty well. But the one thing that I would still do differently for book number 3 is that sometimes I got a little too willing to say yes to things because I figured, oh, well, I'm going to be in the town anyway, so I might as well do it. And so I ended up doing something like 4, I think, public talks in San Francisco. And that was too many. I know a lot of people in San Francisco. I don't know that many. And so doing 4 was a little bit of overkill. I probably should have just maybe done 2 and left it at that, because you don't want to overstretch yourself. There is an opportunity cost with it. And frankly, at a certain point, it is better to just do a podcast or to do a guest post. So that's what I learned in that capacity.
Now, how about mistakes that you made either on book launch 1 or book launch 2 that you learned from?
Well, for book launch 1, I mean, I've definitely tried to correct this over time. So for book launch 1, I mean, I think the biggest mistake was being a little too slack, a little too lackadaisical about emailing people in advance for the pre-orders. I had started doing it, and then honestly what happened was I had a really bad breakup of this 2.5-year relationship, and it happened just a couple of months before my book launch. And so I had to move out of our house, and it was like really draining and dramatic, and it took a lot of my time and energy that otherwise would have probably gone into the launch. And so I was just like, oh, I can't email people and ask them to buy my book. I had too much else going on emotionally, and so I made sure that for the second book that I had my act together a lot more and really, really pushed the pre-orders, and also did not have any breakups immediately beforehand.
So you plan your breakups around the book launches.
Exactly.
Oh, that's great. Any other final marketing tips? Got a couple more questions, but any other final marketing tips before we move on to that?
Well, I think the other just biggest thing, which I've alluded to, that is really powerful and important that I've been trying to focus on this time is hand in hand with book marketing is building my email list, because that gives you so much power to do anything else. It enables you to sell your book. It enables you to sell courses. It enables you to just stay in touch in general. And so prior to my launch, a couple of months prior, I really put in a big effort. So one was creating the free giveaway of the Standout workbook that I was giving on DorieClark.com. Another was I switched email providers to Aweber so that I could, and I think MailChimp is kind of the same thing, but they have a really nice function where they do an autoresponder sequence. So it's just much more sophisticated than the previous email service provider I was using. And so now, instead of just these periodic emails that I used to send, when people sign up, they I'll send out blast emails about things like, oh, we have this amazing summit that Chandler Bolt is organizing, and I'm going to be a part of it. So I'll send a special message. But when people join the list every week, they're getting a ton of really good content. I currently have about 4 months worth, about 16 or so things, and I'm going to continue to be adding to it. But I figured I would start in February with 4 months worth, and just plug that in so that I can have a continuing dialogue with the list and keep them engaged, because that's the thing that is going to enable you to have an even bigger audience for book number 2 and book number 3 and book number 4.
Great. Now, are there so you obviously got book 1, book 2. And then I hear you already talking about book 3. But we touched on the blogging and all that at the beginning. I wanted to circle back on that. Have you used that to sell books? Have you used the books to guest post for higher profile sites? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so that is definitely a big tool. And by the way, Chandler, forgive me, I'm just going to adjust a little bit because the sun is streaming through my New York City apartment windows. So I'll just shift
No
there
problem,
for a
man.
minute so I'm not blinded. But yes, guest posting has been a really big deal. I've done a lot of that as well. A few pieces on that. I mean, number one, one of the most important things, of course, is your tagline at the bottom. So I always try to link to the free giveaway, the free standout workbook to drive people to my list. I consider that of paramount importance, and that's in a lot of ways the reason I'm guest posting. Additionally, I always have links in the bio to my books, and even better, as I've been going through, what I have done is I try to make sure that literally in every article that I write, I have a link somewhere to my book. I have to mention it. Sometimes the whole theme of the article is about the book, but even if it's not, I'll try to throw in as I discussed in my book, Stand Out, blah, 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 blah. And so I'll throw in the link in the mention there, just because, that's what it's there for, is to raise brand awareness and to get people who are a little bit intrigued to be able to say, oh, hey, what's that? Click, and to make it possible. But one strategy that I'll share in terms of coming up with content is I actually, literally went through the book, and I was paging through, and so, your book is divided into sections and whatnot. And so for literally every section of the book, I said to myself, what could this be as a blog post? Like, what would I call a blog post about this section? And so I came up with 50 different titles, and they were just, things that I talked about in that section. And so I have followed up, and I've probably done maybe 20 of them at this point, and I'm going to continue doing them literally up through the end. Write either a straight adaptation or a sort of reworked piece, depending on the needs of the publication and what they're after. But that's what I did, using the content, drawing from the content in the book.
That's great. So it sounds like you've continued to be consistent with that blogging to drive back to the books. Have you pretty much kept that up in a consistent way, or do you amp that up around book launches? Like, how do you schedule that out?
So, I'll say in the last couple of months, because I've been on the road, I have done less blogging. However, that I have been compensating for that in terms of a dramatically increased amount of being on podcasts. So I'm just sort of doing a temporary shift because, of course, whereas you as an individual can be blogging as much as you want, in order to be a guest on a podcast, you sort of need some kind of a news hook, i.e. your book. You can't be on a podcast necessarily every week. So I've been taking the moment to go deep on that. But yes, in general, I am going to be returning to a regular writing schedule, and prior to the book launch, I mean, very, very consistently, at a minimum, for 3.5 years, I blogged for Forbes, and they had a requirement, based on the terms of the contract that I had with them, that I would do at least 5 posts a month, and sometimes more. Sometimes I would do up to 10. So at a minimum, that's 60 posts for Forbes a year. Usually more. I've done, I think, a total of about 250 posts for them, but that was my baseline. In addition to that, I was doing typically weekly posts for Entrepreneur. I would do typically bi-weekly posts for the Harvard Business Review. I would do scattered guest posts elsewhere. So usually what that would look like was somewhere between 10 and 12 blog posts per month, and I had been doing that very assiduously since 2012.
It's a lot of content.
Yeah, it definitely is a lot of content, which is actually how I came to write my ebook, Standout Networking. Mm-hmm. That's, I'll call it like my, it's not really a third book, but it's like a 2.5 book, maybe, a 2.5 book. And what that actually is I took all the blog posts that I had done for Forbes about networking specifically. And it was a lot. It was like maybe 20 blog posts. And I just took that baseline of content, and I didn't create an ebook of just like, oh, here's a bunch of blog posts. I then took the content, reformatted it, just rearranged it so that it made logical sense as one narrative arc about networking and how it should be done right. But of course it was much faster because the core material had already been written. And so I put that together, and I created it literally just from the Forbes blog post. So the great thing about writing the content is that it's not ever wasted. I mean, you can use it initially for just writing stuff and getting your name out there, but you can also later turn it into book content for sure.
Now, Dorie, what would be your kind of parting tip for people thinking about writing a book, or maybe even part of the way through it? What would be your piece of advice for them?
Well, I think there's a lot of different pieces along the way. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about as much, and so I'll just mention it briefly. And I actually cover it even more if you Google Dorie Clark and how to write for high-profile blogs. I have a full article about this. But basically, what you want to think about as you are using blogging as a strategy for building your brand and getting more name recognition is to think of what's known as the ladder strategy. And that is, how can you essentially work on laddering up to blogs of higher and higher profile. So, your first blog is probably not going to be for some name, the first post you ever write is probably not going to be for some name brand institution. It's probably just going to be your own blog that you have, or you do it for LinkedIn or for Medium or something like that. But in that, that's great. So you get a few clips, but then you want to increasingly start reaching out to institutions that are better known. And so, maybe you start with a professional association, a regional professional association, and then you start to reach out to something that's a little better known than that, and then a little better known than that. And as you're doing that, that increases the level of social proof that you have. Because it is, I've found a powerful thing where you can say, oh, well, you're a contributor to Harvard Business Review and to Time and to Entrepreneur. And that gets people to at least listen, to pay attention more. And it doesn't mean that I'm a better writer than other people necessarily, but it means that because of the backing of those brands, it's easier to catch people's attention and for them to give you the benefit of the doubt and listen. And so having those tools in your arsenal is useful, and you can do that literally the way that I started writing for Forbes. I mean, that was a cold email. That was me reaching out. I found the email address of the guy, the guy in charge, the managing editor, and I sent him, as we were talking about earlier, my bio, some clips from other places, and what I was interested in doing. And 2 days later, he called me back and wanted to set up a call, and we made it happen. So you can, even if you don't know anyone, you can break in if you assemble the material right and are, working assiduously at it.
That's great. Well, Dorie, this has been awesome. Really enjoyed this interview. Before we break here, where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, thank you, Chandler. Well, I will certainly encourage listeners to check out the Standout Workbook. Because hopefully it will be of interest to you in terms of its actual self. Because it is 139 questions to walk you progressively through the process of how to develop your own breakthrough idea and build a following around it. So hopefully it can be a useful resource tool for you. But additionally, it may just be useful to see as an example of what a giveaway like this looks like. So that could be a helpful thing. I'll also mention I didn't do the design of it. I actually convinced my publisher to have the in-house designers do it for us as part of the marketing campaign. So that's a little trick you can pull as well. But you can download that for free, the 42-page Standout Workbook, at dorieclark.com, which is DORIECLARK.com. And my books are Reinventing You and Stand Out, and the ebook, Standout Networking.
Awesome. Dorie, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chandler.